Welcome to Women Who Code podcast. This is Sarah. I'm a PhD student based out of India. And in today's session, we will be talking about various aspects of detecting and mitigating bias in online toxic speech detection systems and how those biases live at the intersection of gender and bias, gender bias as well as racial bias. So, as I was telling, I'm a PhD student based out of India. I am a member of the Laboratory for Computational Social Systems, LCS2 for short, and we study various aspects of natural language processing and social computing. Within that broad area of social computing, my work specifically focuses on analyzing different aspects of hate speech, how to detect it, how it is spreading, what are the various biases that exist within these systems, how do we make the toxic speech detection systems more robust. Now, when I talk about the theme of bias in toxicity detection, there are two aspects that we need to cover. First, what is meant by toxicity, and second, how do we define presence and mitigate the presence of bias in toxicity detection models. So hate speech, as we know, has existed within the human community for as long as our civilization dates back. So the presence of some form of stereotypes or hateful content has always existed in the real world. We see discrimination and bias happening all the time. And with the online world, those same stereotypes and biases get amplified. So cognitively speaking, some biases help us because they help us make decision faster. They are important for our evolution as a species. However, just because they help us reach a decision faster doesn't mean that biases help us filter the right information and help us make correct decisions all the time. But when our biased interactions in the online world are used as a source of data to train the machine learning models, the machine learning models pick on these bias cues. They basically do statistical sampling of the data that is provided and try to develop patterns to discriminate different classes. And if we have certain stereotypes that get reinforced again and again, then those same stereotypes act as significant or statistical data points for the model to use as a basis for their classification. For example, we know that a lot of time content is presented in a manner that technical things or technology is meant only for boys and geeks, and females and other minority groups are usually excluded from it. And if we have a lot of, say, web pages that talk about only boys being programmer, then at the end, when we have machine learning models that are trying to make sense of different words and associate different words, so when the word embeddings, as we say, get trained on these data sets, what happens is that they learn the co-occurrence, the frequency between the term boys and tech, and they associate boys to be more technical than females. Now, this is a stereotype that exists in the real world, and because of their frequent usage in the online world, they get picked by the models that depend on the online data, and then these biases get amplified and even in some cases become the base for the model to start learning things. For example, in natural language processing, we have word vectors, and there have been extensive studies to show that these word vectors are biased. Gender is, as I said, one aspect of it. There are studies that have shown that these word vectors discriminate based on the dialect. So when these vectors are employed in association with speech detection systems, they are able to pick certain dialects better than the other. There have been studies that show that certain names that sound to be of Black origin have been associated with negative adjectives and negative sentiments within the word embedding model, and all of and all of these concepts or all of these biases within the natural language processing systems, within the speech recognition systems, and yes, within say the facial recognition systems, when these individual units are employed in detection of harmful content on the web, then all of these biases get trickled down and get amplified in the toxicity and harm detection systems. So I'll take a quick tangent to talk about what we mean by toxicity on the web. So as I was saying that hateful content has been known to exist for as long as the human history exists. Unfortunately, there is no strict definition of what can be considered hateful, what can be considered toxic, because it depends on the context, it depends on the geography, it depends on the social platform you are talking about, it depends on time. There are certain terms that were once associated to be abusive and offensive, but now have been reclaimed by the very people against whom these words were spoken. So we have a contemporary contextual feature associated with detection of toxic content. It is not as objective as trying to detect the presence of cat in an image, and no matter what modification you make in terms of like rotating the image, the cat remains a cat. However, in NLP, even minor perturbations in changing one word or changing the sentiment of one word can modify the sentence's context completely. And then if you start looking at the nuances of who is talking to whom, who is this, what community this person represents, what vulnerable group, what marginalized group this person represents, what is the bigger context of this conversation, what was said before, what has been said after. Once you start adding all of these features, you realize that detection of toxic content and even adversarially attacking such content is very difficult and contextual in nature. And it is difficult not just at a computational level, it is difficult even at human level. Say content moderators and annotators who are labeling large amount of data and flagging it to be toxic or non-toxic, flagging it to be hateful and hurtful, if they are not aware of the context within which something was said, then it can lead to production of misclassified labels. The data itself can be corrupted by the lack of information on the annotator's side. In fact, even biases on the annotator's side. Say you want to mitigate racial bias in labeling of your hate speech data, and you tell the annotator that, hey, this statement was made by someone from the Black community. Now, if the annotator is desensitized, they will use this information in the correct context. But if the annotator themselves are biased against a particular race, say here the Black community, then they can use this extra information to reinforce that bias and purposely label the data is hateful just because they have prejudice that they want to reinforce. So how you present these sensitive attributes to the moderators and annotators is important, and there is no like golden rule of how such content can be provided so that the context is complete. At the same time, it doesn't reveal existing prejudice of the people who are looking at such content and flagging it and moderating it. So but what happens is that when these data sets are labeled for toxicity, when they are labeled for flagged as hateful and non-hateful, and then these data sets are employed in detection systems, we build classification systems, whatever biases that have come in form of annotations and labeling, and the data that we collected gets trickled down into the models themselves. And then once you start looking at these models from different verticals, like how is this model performing when I look at a content that is either written by or written against female. Let's say, how is this model performing if the content that we are analyzing is associated with Black community, or is it associated with Muslims? So how is sexism, racism, Islamophobia captured contextually by the model? When we start analyzing it at these aspects, we start seeing some unintended biases that, as I said, get trickled down from the source into these different demographics group. In fact, recent studies have also shown that your political ideology can also be a source of unintended bias for the model. So the use of certain terms and phrases by people of one political orientation versus the other can be used by the model to discriminate and say that one group is more toxic than the other, as I said, in absence of context. So coming back to the demographic groups, which we will be focusing on in this talk, we have mainly I will be discussing about race and gender and the intersection of the two. Now, determining whether a content is posted by a specific demographic group is difficult. Say race, for example. In race, especially in the English literature for natural language processing and toxicity detection, when people have studied race, they have mainly looked at the discrimination against the Black community and the dialect which is termed as the African American dialect. Now here the notion is not that one dialect is better than the other, but because of the prevalence of the data that is present online, one dialect gets discriminated against more than the other. And in this case, it is the African American dialect that receives more discrimination. So what happens is that if a text is posted by someone from the Black community and they are talking colloquially in the language in which they talk with other members of the community, a third party view of that data set, whether it's a content moderator or a toxicity detection system and a computer or a or a software that is looking at this context, this interaction, without the context of this person belonging to Black community talking to another person from the Black community, just the presence of certain words can be used as, say, marking the content as hateful. So presence of ethnic slurs, presence of keywords, presence of colloquial terms that could be acceptable within the community, but unacceptable otherwise, can be used as a source of bias for the model to use as a discrimination point. And when that happens, the false positive against these communities, for example, the Black community in this case, increases. So what happens as a result, if you look at the broader social impact, you are saying that I want to build a model that will detect hate against the Black community. But unfortunately, these unintended biases will lead you to detect the content posted by the Black community to be more hateful. And when that happens, their content gets flagged more, their content gets taken down more. And as a result, instead of helping the Black community, you are actually reinforcing the marginalization, because you are developing a platform, or you are leading towards a platform which is not democratic to provide equal opportunity of being of Black people being themselves and being able to colloquially communicate their ideas. So the result of presence of unintended bias in toxicity detection is that it starts discriminating against the very community it is supposed to protect the toxicity for. So all the vulnerable target group that we want to help end up becoming victims of the very systems that we deploy. So race, as I said, is one factor. So there was a study by a group of researchers trying to analyze the presence of and influence of dialect in toxicity detection system. So they used Twitter data set, and they mapped it to the US Census data set to build up approximation of who the speaker is and which community they belong to. So whether they belong to the Black community, whether they have a white orientation dialect, whether they have Hispanic dialect, and so on. So they combined the Twitter data, online data, and the location feature, as well as the timeline history of the users, and mapped it to the census data to approximate which group of people represent what kind of dialect, and then they build statistical models to detect the dialect. Now, unfortunately, there are drawbacks to this system, but currently the toxicity detection community largely has used and is dependent on this baseline system to detect dialects. Now, one issue with this is that it assumes that all dialect and the words present in all the dialects have equal chance of occurrence. It doesn't take, as I said, it doesn't take into account the context. So it is possible that certain phrases are acceptable in one dialect and not in the other, but the model currently doesn't account for that. And then there is also an issue of misappropriation. A lot of time, people from extremist groups and people who are trollers, they mask their identity of belonging to a certain community and adopting their dialect in order to spread negative feelings and sentiment about the very group. Now, existing systems don't have a way of discriminating and knowing whether this is a person who genuinely belongs to the target community or whether it is someone who is misappropriating. And if such noisy data in terms of misappropriation, in terms of trolling gets added to the system, then our models develop even further bias of what the community is representative of. So directly assuming someone's Twitter bio or location to be a source of their dialect is problematic in nature, but at the same time, it is one of the approximation that is available for us to study discrimination of dialect-based discrimination within the toxicity detection systems. So when the researchers used this pipeline to determine dialect-based bias, they found that people from the Black community were more likely to have their content flagged based on the dialect being detected as someone belonging to the Black community. Uh, and what the authors did as a means of mitigating it is that they employed generative AI systems. So for example, the ChatGPT systems that we have now, at that time, it was a GPT-3 model. So they employed the GPT-3 model, and they gave samples to the models saying that this is a series of Black dialects, and these are some statements written in non-Black or say the white dialect, and please translate and style transfer from one dialect to another. So they took a toxicity detection data set and they marked the dialect on this data set using the dialect pipeline that I mentioned earlier. And once they had that, they asked the generative AI to translate and style transfer from one dialect to another so that the content remains the same, but the way in which it is spoken is slightly modified. And then this modified sample was given to a toxicity detection model, and the model is asked to classify whether it thinks the content, whether it thinks the content is hateful or not. And if the model with the transformed dialect is saying that, hey, I think that this is non-toxic in nature, but the same content in a different dialect is said to be toxic, then we can say that, hey, it looks like the model has a bias towards dialect, and it is not focusing on the content and the context, but rather using dialect as a discriminating feature. And once you're able to determine this, you can use this corrective pipeline. So it is possible that certain black oriented dialects were annotated as hate, but you can, using this generative AI and style transferring pipeline, you can make the correction in the label and augment your data set so that correct augmented information is given to the toxicity detection model. And the authors observed that when this simple corrective pipeline was used, they were able to reduce the false positive rate for the text being detected as hateful against the Black community. So this was a simple experiment they ran, and this was a simple pipeline they proposed. But it highlights that by using these methods, we can determine whether the toxicity detection models is actually capturing the hateful context, or is it just capturing certain markers of identity and then using them to call out hateful content. In fact, certain keywords like the presence of the word Islam, the presence of the word black, irrespective of the context in which it is said, just the presence of certain keywords and phrases can trigger the model to say that this content is hateful. This again goes back to the fact that a lot of content posted against the Black community or against Muslims is negative in nature, and then when our embeddings and our toxicity detection models are trained on that content, it reinforces, it retains that negative notion and reinforces that bias when it is used in the detection systems. So, as I said, using simple corrective pipelines is one way of overcoming it. Another could be the use of adversarial techniques. So, in another set of research, a group of researchers, what they did was they said that, okay, I have a toxicity detection model, and then I have a model that detects dialect. I'm going to use this dialect detection system as a base, and I will mark all my samples for the dialect, and then I will develop a discriminative model. So I have one model that is detecting hate, and then at the same time, the embedding that is used, the word embedding or the sentence embedding that is used to detect hate, I'm going to send the same embedding to a discriminator, and this discriminator will try to predict the protective attribute of dialect. And if it is able to do that, it means that the embedding that my model is learning, that has markers of dialect, and it is using that to predict toxicity. So the aim of this adversarial system is to make sure that at the end, I am I am building towards sentence embeddings that are specifically focused on the context, so that the classification of the text being hateful is as accurate as possible, while at the same time the same embedding has as less influence or as less dialect based feature as possible, so that the discriminator that is supposed to detect dialect performs as worse as possible. And the combination of these two systems was found to again reduce the bias in terms of bias in detecting hateful content against people from the Black community. And as I said, the issue with all of these systems that try to analyze and mitigate bias against racial stereotypes is that they assume that the model that is used in determining the presence of racial slurs and racial ethnicity uh, is accurate, which it is not. It has its own set of flaws, and it has its own set of biases that it was built on, and again that get trickled down and reinforced. And so one aspect for future direction of studying racial bias is to build better systems of first detecting the presence of certain racial slur and ethnicity, while at the same time not using those systems against the very ethnic group that we are trying to study. So developing of such systems require not just like knowledge about these cultural groups and knowledge about the ethical slurs, but also knowledge about the context. For example, there was a study analyzing hateful content within the drag community, and it observed that for an unintended audience who is not aware of how the people within the drag community communicate with each other, they use a lot of harsh, seemingly harsh and openly like harsh and abusive terms to actually encourage each other. Now, if a third person is looking at this and they're not aware of how the drag community colloquially communicates, they're going to think that this is an abusive content. So the such behavior and sensitization of the third person to know that, oh, okay, this is not hateful content. This is just two people having like a conversation with each other, and these are just friends pulling each other's leg. And if this context is provided, they will be able to better detect, as I said, the ethnic slurs and racial dialects. So providing the context, desensitizing the annotator, and then using these systems in combination with desensitized annotator will be leading towards better detection of dialects and ethnic slurs. Second is we need to combine not just our census-based information and our online information, but also look at other sources of data, also involve people from other background, not just statisticians and not just computer scientists, but also people from who study race from a social perspective, who study race from a psychological perspective, so that their inputs can also be used in determining whether the quality of the data that has been collected is representative of the community that we want to map to statistically. So all of this is necessary, and I hope that in future our group and other research group, when they study racial bias in toxicity detection, they are able to account for this. Uh, Moving on from racial bias to another aspect that I wanted to cover in this session is that of gender bias. Now, again, we are well aware of the fact that the word embedding have issues determining feminine and masculine feature. Again, this is an unfortunate situation that majority of the study which tries to look at different aspects of gender bias in word embedding systems, in NLP system, as well as in toxicity detection system. They assume this binary demarcation of masculine and feminine. We definitely need more fine grain and diverse labels for analyzing gender and sexual orientation based biases in toxicity detection. However, going back to what the existing studies have looked at, when they look at the discrimination between the masculine and the feminine aspects of word embedding with respect to hate speech, they found that feminine uh, abusive slurs like certain words like bitch were more likely to be associated with hateful content, especially if the gender of the user was known to be female. This was because the word embedding was not looking at the context, but rather focusing on a specific term and associating that to the gender, like the gendered abuse, and using that as a discrimination for classifying the content as hateful. So, based on this observation, what one group of researchers suggested was that why not we perform data augmentation and gender in terms of gender swapping. So, if you have a statement that says she is a bitch, you augment that by saying he is a bitch, and that way you're telling the model that they need to focus on the context of the sentence and not just associate certain gender with certain keywords and use that as hateful. Of course, in when you're performing these gender augmentation, you are assuming that the label is already correct, and then the augmented data will adopt the label of whatever sentence it was augmenting upon. So going back to the previous example, I'm assuming that the statement may including both he and she are non-toxic in nature, and this context is given to the model to learn on. However, issue with gender swapping based augmentation techniques, as I said, first they only look at the binary classification of gender. Second, within the NLP, within the field of NLP, certain word swapping may lead to gibberish content. For example, if you have a statement that says she is pregnant and expecting to deliver soon, if you replace she with he, you are producing somewhat factually incorrect statement. So, if the model picks on it, it is actually picking on gibberish information and trying to make sense of that. So it's not that you can blindly do a gender swapping. This needs to be supervised by a human in the loop to say that, okay, does this swapping make sense in the real world? Does this swapping make sense within the context of hate speech or not? So a blind swapping is not possible. Similarly, when the authors did the swapping of dialects, they assumed that the dialect swapping will not lead to change in context, or the context that is now generated, the statement that is now generated is as valid in both the dialects. However, that is not the case. So similarly, for gender, not all style transfer will lead to correct, factually correct, as well as semantically correct statements. So that needs to be analyzed and accounted for. Otherwise, we are feeding the model gibberish, and we may in fact reinforce the biases that we wanted to remove. Another way of trying to reduce the presence of unintended bias with respect to gender in toxicity detection models would be to use de-biased word embedding. So a good amount of research has been done, and it's still ongoing in the area of debiasing our word embeddings. So if you assume word embeddings to be vectors in n-dimensional space, and you are saying that there is a negative term, an abusive term that is associated more with females, so it is closer in space, vector space, to female as a masculine, a feminine and female as a axis compared to masculine or male as an axis, then the aim of debiasing technique is to bring this term at an equal distance from both the masculine and the feminine axis, and that way you say that the embedding has been debiased because it is now not sensitive to the abusive term being associated more with a particular gender. Now, a similar exercise has been done in terms of like profession. So the famous paper of man is to programmer and women is to nurse, or man is to doctor and a female is to doctor, or female is to nurse or homemaker. So you have a professional axis and you have the gender axis, and you want the professional axis to be equally distant from both the genders. Again, here you have to be sensitive about the context and whether certain debiasing makes sense or not. But overall, if we assume that we have word embeddings that have been debiased with respect to gender, we assume that they are more that they are in a sense equivalent to desensitized humans who about gender. So if we use those debiased word embeddings in toxicity detection models, then we obviously observe a reduction in false positive when determining toxic content against females. So simple effective techniques like gender swapping and debiasing or the mitigation using already debiased embedding for mitigation of gender bias have been studied in the literature. Then comes the once you have studied say aspects of race and gender, then comes the question of what happens at the intersection of the two. Now through one series of studies and experiments and research, we have seen that people from Black community are more likely to have their content labeled as toxic. At the same time, you have another series of studies that says that abusive terms have a higher chance of being associated with as a feminine attribute than a masculine attribute. So you know that content targeted against and generated by women will be more likely to be labeled as toxic. But when you look at the intersection of the two, when you start looking at race and gender together, then one study found that Black male are more likely to have their content labeled as hateful compared to, say, a Black female compared to white male and white female. So it's an interesting finding, and it is important to acknowledge that when we look at biases at the intersection of more than two components, then we start seeing these issues. So we are acknowledging the diversity in the real world, but we are not acknowledging the same diversity when we start looking at biases in our machine learning models and biases in our toxicity detection model. So study at the intersection of more biases is important. It is not that extensively explored so far. So another aspect of intersection bias is not just gender and race, but when you start including geography as a feature. Most of the data set within the hate speech community, within the toxicity speech detection community, focuses on English text. And even when you have data set on memes, it consists of Western references, Western cultures, and the text within the meme is English. So you are looking at toxicity or even the intersection of race and gender from a Western perspective. How will that look in other geographies is less studied. How that maps or translates from one geography to another is still not that explored. So we need the research community to ask questions as to what will happen when we start looking at the side effects of the data and the toxicity detection models that we have from a non-Western perspective of race, gender, religion, ageism, political orientation, and so on. And at the intersection of race and gender lies the issue that when you are trying to say de-bias and debug one aspect, how does it impact the other? So this was an interesting observation we made in as a part of our survey, that there are certain mitigation techniques that propose that instead of using a particular term that is considered hateful, why not replace it with a more generic term? So say you know that the term Islam and Muslim are constantly labeled as hateful. Why not replace it with generic terms like religion and faith? So while intuitively it makes sense that yes, if you replace this with generic terms, you are going to see a reduction in bias against the word Muslim and Islam. However, what we observe is that the bias doesn't go away. It just shifts. It just moves like energy is neither created nor destroyed. So bias by itself cannot be destroyed. It just moves from one form to another. So what we observed was a shift in bias from the term Islam to the term religion. So if you are looking, going back to the case of intersection of gender and race, if you are looking at mitigating say racial bias, how does it influence or translate into bias against gender? Does it lead to an increase in the false positive with respect to gender? Does it reduce it? Can the two be what you can say can the two aspects be debiased at the same time? So asking these questions is important, and this is one of the open areas of research as to how you look at these side effects together and not just look at one aspect of bias in isolation. Because in isolation, we have identified their presence and we have developed techniques, of course, incomplete and ongoing, but there are techniques for mitigation of bias in individual verticals. Now, how do you bring them together is going to be not just interesting, but also important, because as I said, that diversity in the real world needs to be acknowledged and accounted for when we are studying bias at toxicity in the online world. And more or less on those lines, I would like to conclude this discussion by saying that there are important questions that still remain open. For example, talking about how to make our study of bias more inclusive and more fine-grained, and not just looking at it from a male versus female perspective, but rather a broader spectrum. How do we look at ethnicity as and racial bias as not just black versus white, but also include other ethnic groups and other racial minority in this? And how do we, in the first place, improve the quality and quantity of the data that is representative of these communities in the first place? So yeah, with that, I would like to conclude, hoping that some of the discussion that we have had right now will be helpful to future researchers. At the end, I would just like to remind the research community that when we are talking about Black versus white, when we are talking about African American as a dialect, or when we are using certain slurs or abusive words in our research and in our discussion, it is only meant for the purpose of the discussion, and we do not endorse any sort of discrimination against any race or gender. And I hope that the audience takes that along with them. Thank you. You can reach out to me on Twitter. I am the Messiah, TH_THEMESSIER. You can reach out to me and we can discuss more about the research in the area of hate speech detection on the web, toxicity on the web, mitigation techniques and bias, and do check out the survey that we have collected, reviewing all of the methods in analyzing and mitigating bias in toxicity speech. Thank you.